Okay, welcome to lecture 7. Excuse me, I'm drinking a little bit of soda with a special additive. And so if I belch, you'll just have to put up with me, as you always do. Thank you. All right, so I know that it's been, get this adjusted. I know that it's been a while since you've seen a lecture. Last week just got away from me. So we're just going to pick up this week with chapter 7 and just keep plowing through and doing the best that we can. I I know I'm not the only one who's been struggling to keep things going at a consistent pace. Other teachers are having similar issues. Students are having issues keeping up with a consistent pace. So it's life in the time of the Rona. So we'll just do the best that we can. And what else can we do, right? Okay, so the fact is, though, I am never going to penalize you for my failures. I will never penalize students for my failures. So if I do something that's ridiculous or I blow past deadlines and don't post things in time, I am certainly not going to hold you accountable. So I try to be fair. I do my best to be fair. So, all right, let's get into the material. And let's talk about utilitarianism. So last time we talked about act utilitarianism. And act utilitarianism is a moral theory that is what we consider a consequentialist theory. So if you recall, at the top of the lecture outline for chapter 6, I provided you with a little bit of a, let me pull it up here on my, oh, I don't have it on my iPad. Excuse me. Okay, so at the top of the outline, you'll see that there was a little diagram where I had an intention, an action, and consequences. Okay, so in order for something to be considered an act, it has to be done with intention. And an intention is just a mental state that one has, right? So I intend to X, whatever X is. So I intend to take a drink. That's what we call a mental state. That an effective intention is one that brings us all the way through to action, right? But I can intend to take a drink, but something might prevent me from doing it. Or if nothing prevents me from doing it, then I have an effective intention. Okay, so an intention is just a mental state that helps us, that motivates us to act. Okay, it's a motivational mental state. And then, of course, there's action. So what distinguishes an action from just a mere behavior is the intention, right? So you can behave in various ways. There are lots of different kinds of behaviors. But behaviors don't have intention behind them. Could be compulsive. They could be thoughtless, right? They could just be programmed behaviors. So reflexes, right? So if you get near something hot, you're going to have a reflex to jerk your hand back. That's not an action. That's a behavior. It's a programmed reflex. It's a programmed behavior. So the intention is what's going to distinguish mere behaviors from actions. And what we're interested in when we're talking about morality is we're interested in actions, right? What makes an action morally right or wrong? So you've got the intent, you've got the action, and then you have the consequences of the action. And the consequences of an action are going to matter for certain theories, and other theories are going to consider the intention the most important part. Right now, we're talking about consequentialist theories. So consequentialist theories are going to take the consequences of an action to be the morally relevant thing, okay? So they don't care what your intention is, they care what the consequences of your actions are, okay? So when we looked at act utilitarianism, we saw that there's a very simple rule for Mill's utilitarianism. Remember, if you're going to look at the consequences of an action, you have to decide what good and bad are, right? So how are we measuring consequences? Well, some consequences are good and some consequences are bad. So we have to sort of balance out what is the good and the bad in this situation, and does this action, are these consequences going to produce net good, right? So net good is your good minus your bad, and then whatever's left over. So there should be net good. Otherwise, that action is not going to be the correct action according to this moral theory. So, so you have to really think through your consequences, and you have to think about your actions before you actually do them, in order for this to be, you know, how can I put this? Actions that you do without considering the consequences, you're still going to be morally responsible for them. So there's still either morally right or wrong. But if you care, let's put it this way, if you care about being a moral person, then you're going to need to stop and consider the consequences of your actions, right? Regardless of what your intention is, according to consequentialist moral theories, right? So, so I drew a distinction last time between consequentialist theories that that apply to specific actions in specific scenarios, specific cases, and consequentialist theories that apply to more general types of actions. So this week, when we talk about rule utilitarianism, we're going to talk about general types of actions and how you can work that into a utilitarian theory. So, so we already talked about good and bad last week, right? So Mill defines good in terms of happiness and happiness in terms of pleasure. So that is a very simple theory. That's what we call moral hedonism or ethical hedonism. Basically the same thing. We use the words moral and ethical interchangeably, although they're technically not the same word. They don't technically mean the same thing, but we do often use them interchangeably, and we're going to do that in this course. So, so ethical hedonism, that's just the idea that what the only thing that is good for people, for human beings, or any animal really, but the only thing that is good and that we have to consider morally is pleasure, right? So when I'm thinking about the consequences of my actions, all I have to do is figure out what is the net pleasure for the greatest number of people that any action is going to produce, right? So that is just a very simple moral theory. Happiness just is pleasure. Okay, so I went through this last time, but I'm just refreshing because it's been 2 weeks, and I know that you haven't probably reviewed lecture 6 before looking at this, which you don't have to. Quite honestly, this is my fault. This is why I'm doing a little bit of a review. So there are other consequentialist theories where you can define good in different ways. So you might think that meaningfulness in life, or autonomy, or education, these things might be valuable in and of themselves, and they might contribute to our well-being. So, so those things might be good, in addition to pleasure, right? So you can have a list of things that you think are good. There are some people who do that. Or you can say, well, pleasure is good, but also desire satisfaction is good. So the satisfaction of your desires contributes to your well-being. That's what we consider good, right? We're talking about human well-being. Good impacts human well-being. So maybe it's just that desire satisfaction is what contributes to a person's well-being in addition to whatever pleasure they experience. Okay, that's a much more complicated theory. You can define all different kinds of good, all right? So the theory that we looked at last week, 2 weeks ago, is just it's the simplest consequentialist theory out there. Hedonism, ethical hedonism or utilitarianism is just the simplest. Actually, ethical hedonism is a different view than utilitarianism. Ethical hedonism just is the view that the only thing that is good for us is pleasure. I'm pretty sure they define that in the book. And utilitarianism is just the view about what makes an action morally right or wrong, and they incorporate ethical hedonism into the utilitarian view. Okay. This week we're still on utilitarianism, and we're not going to get into too much detail about any specific theories and the way they define good. We're just going to treat it generally as, we're just going to talk about good. Okay, we're not going to get into any specific theories like Mill's utilitarianism is a specific moral theory. We're just going to talk about rule utilitarianism in a general way, and we're going to use good in just a very broad sense. Okay, so what is rule utilitarianism? Well, it's an alternative to act utilitarianism, and it was developed in response to some of the objections to utilitarianism, right? So if you recall, there were some problems with utilitarianism. Like one problem is that um, you have a lot of calculating to do. If you're going to be an act utilitarian, you have to consider every action. You have to consider the consequences of those actions, which means you have to have a lot of knowledge in order to accurately predict the consequences of your actions. And then you have to do a lot of calculating and figuring out what's your net good, right, for your range of options. That's a pretty sophisticated process. So, so that might be really difficult for some people, right? So that's one problem with act utilitarianism. Another problem with act utilitarianism is that it allows for the violation of a person's rights, right? So if it is going to bring about world peace to torture a child, then you have a moral obligation to torture that child, according to act utilitarianism. I mean, that's just a no-brainer, right? World peace brings about an overwhelming amount of good, and the bad experience, the harm that the child experiences, or that the torturer also might experience torturing, right? That is not at all going to outweigh the good that it'll produce. The good is so immense that an act utilitarian would say that you're required to do that. Again, I know that this is a far-fetched scenario. And we know that we're never going to find ourselves in a situation like that, right? It's possible that in some set of conditions that would be the case, but that's not likely to occur in this world, right? In our reality. So I know that what I'm saying, you're probably going, who's ever going to be in that situation? Nobody, probably nobody, at least not in this world, right? And when I say world, I mean universe, right? So in this totality of reality, it is likely to never be the case that that's going to happen. But the reason we have these scenarios that are so kind of outlandish is because we want you to focus on the principle, right? We're just looking at what are the structural features, the logical features of the scenario, and does it deliver the kind of result that we want? So we narrow our scenarios down to these sort of outlandish sort of situations to test a moral theory. So, you know, the violation, so the child is, in this scenario that we're talking about, this child is going to have certain rights. And one of them is a right to life. Especially here in the United States, that's just a basic right that's protected according to the Constitution. But you might think that there are human rights, basic human rights, and basic human rights are going to definitely include the right to life and the right to bodily integrity, right? So if you think that there are things such as basic human rights, and I think the vast majority of us probably do, then you've got a problem. If you also want to be an act utilitarian, then it's hard to reconcile basic human rights with this particular view. Okay, so that is a problem for act utilitarianism. Another one is that it's just very demanding, right? So not only is it demanding in the sense that it's hard to calculate and that we have to think about the consequences of every action that we perform every day, but most of us are doing the wrong thing every day, all the time. Like most of our actions are going to be wrong, morally wrong. So for instance, the morally correct thing to do might be to donate 90% of your salary to various organizations that help poor people and to live on 10%, right? How many of us would do that? I mean, not all of us could do that, okay? So if that's going to put you below the poverty line, then that's not a good idea. I don't think that, I'm not sure. You'd have to figure out, it might still, I mean, even if it does put you below the poverty line, your suffering and the consequences of all of that might still not be enough to outweigh the good that it produces. So you kind of have to put yourself into these sacrificial situations, these self-sacrificing situations. In fact, I actually know of a philosopher, I don't know him personally, but I know of a philosopher at Princeton. I think he's at Princeton. He's either at Princeton or Yale. I'm pretty sure he's at Princeton. Who actually does this. He actually donates 90% of his income and lives on 10% because he is a strict utilitarian. He also does a lot of advocacy for animal rights. So the guy really practices this theory. He believes it's true and he practices it. And he's a vegan. He donates most of his money. I mean, this guy is a moral saint. But that's just what this act utilitarianism demands of us. So it's pretty demanding, right? According to act utilitarianism, we're all just moral schmucks. Well, I already knew that about myself. That might be news to the rest of you, though, right? You guys are not moral angels. Ooh. We all like to think that we're better than we are. So, gonna take a sip. All right, so these are the problems that we identified with act utilitarianism. Rule utilitarianism is supposed to solve some of these problems. Okay, so all of that should have been review from last lecture. Now we're getting into the new material. Okay, so rule utilitarianism is a consequentialist theory, but instead of addressing specific acts, it addresses types of acts, right? So there are rules that cover types of acts, like this. Here's a rule. Here's a moral rule. One should never tell a lie. Covers a wide range of acts, possible actions that you can take in any given situation, right? That's a very general rule, right? So it just covers instances of lying. And there are lots of different ways that that can occur. So this is a general rule that covers a certain type of act. Okay, but a moral action, what makes a moral action right, according to a rule utilitarian, is that it adheres to or conforms to a moral rule, right? And that moral rule has to be justified. So it's not just the case that any moral rule that you can come up with, right? Say, it's wrong not to share your French fries with Jenny. That's my moral rule. And I think the world would be a better place if everybody followed that moral rule, right? You ought to share your French fries with Jenny. So I could come up with that moral rule, and it seems like a plausible moral rule. But what justifies that? So it's not just any rule that's going to make an action morally correct. The rule has to be a specific type, okay? So we've got the principle of rules here, and this is taken right out of the book. A morally right rule or practice, we're just going to emphasize rules here, is one that would promote significantly greater overall utility or good, right? So utility and good, we use those interchangeably. So a morally right rule is one that would promote significantly greater overall utility if widely followed than if it did not exist, okay? So does the rule if this rule exists, and we're not pitting rules against one another, we're just saying, here's the rule. If it exists and it promotes, generally speaking, the greatest amount of good for society, if people widely follow it, that's all you need to morally justify that rule, right? So instead of specific acts producing the greatest amount of good, we've got rules now. So we've just got these general rules like if everybody followed this rule, one should never tell a lie, would it be the case that society would be generally better off? Like there's a greater amount of good in society if people don't lie than if they do lie. Let's put it that way. So you got to think about it this way. If everybody lies all the time, that's going to undermine social cohesion. That's going to undermine cooperation. That's going to undermine a lot of social functions, right? So in partnerships and relationships, right? So if everybody just lied all the time, what could we accomplish? There's a certain level of trust that we have to extend in social interactions, and that's just the way society works. And usually that works out for us, right? Usually our trust is justified because people generally do follow this rule. Generally speaking, right? They don't lie. They're pretty honest for the most part. Like, I'm not talking like, yeah, things are different now. As society gets a lot more complicated, things become a lot more complicated. So we're not talking about online behavior, just interactions at the grocery store, right? So suppose you're just having an interaction with some stranger at the grocery store. You're putting a certain level of trust in that person, that they're presenting themselves as who they are, that they're honest, They're not lying to you, right? Whatever, right? And most of the time, it's okay to do that because most of the time people just aren't going to try to deceive us. Okay, so is that rule justified? Well, if everybody lied all the time, that would not be a great society. It would be really difficult for us. So if we have a rule that says you ought not lie, right? Then it looks like society is going to be better off because that rule exists. And if that's the case, if that rule satisfies that condition, then according to rule utilitarianism, according to the principle of rules, it's a justified rule. It's morally justified, okay? So if you act according to that rule, then your action is morally right. Okay, so we have an act and we have a rule. What makes an action morally right is if it adheres to a morally justified rule. What justifies that rule? Well, that's what the principle of rule says. If this rule is widely followed in society and society is better off because of it, then it's justified, right? So that's still pretty simple. As far as moral theories go, that's still pretty simple. And you're going to see just how simple this is. I mean, it's simpler than act utilitarianism in some ways, right? And you're going to see how it is much, much, much simpler than the deontological theory we're going to talk about in chapter 8. That's got all kinds of moving parts, right? It's very complicated. It came out of a very complicated brain, I can tell you that. All right, so we've got the principle of rules, the principle of acts. Morally right act is one that follows a morally right or justified rule, right? Rules identified as morally right by the principles of rules should be followed except when they come into direct conflict with one another. Okay. Now we have a little bit of a snag here. So what happens if you've got a Nazi knocking on your door and you've got Jews hidden in your basement? What are you going to do? Nazi knocks on your door. Why the sound effects? I don't know. I suck at sound effects. But you've got this Nazi knocking at your door. You open up the door and he's like, "Excuse me, are you hiding Jews in your basement?" I'm sure that's not how it happened, but we can imagine this scenario, right? So suppose it just was this straightforward, "Are you hiding Jews?" What do you do? Well, you have a rule that says you shouldn't lie. One ought not lie, right? That's a moral rule, and that seems to be justified. So that's a rule that seems to apply in this situation. But then you might also have a rule that says we ought to protect the life of others. We ought to preserve human life when at all possible, right? So that seems like preserving human life seems like a really, again, think about it. Is this rule justified? Well, are we better off as a society if we all follow that rule, that we do everything we can to preserve and protect human life? Yes, right? Just having people running around completely carelessly acting in ways that they don't give a shit about other people's well-being or their lives. That would not be a good society. I would not want to live in that society, let me tell you that. That's not a society I would choose, okay? So I think that this rule, that one ought to protect and preserve human life whenever possible. Now, the question is, which rule should you follow? They're in conflict. Because in order to protect and preserve human life, you're going to have to lie. But if you tell the truth, you're going to be putting people in their lives in danger. What do you do? I'll let you think about that while I drink my rum and Coke. I think most of us are going to say lie, right? There are just circumstances under which you ought to lie. Human life matters more than any good that can come from not lying. I mean, it's not, you can't calculate the good in the situation. You have to figure out, you have to only use the rules though, right? So you have to say, which of these rules seems superior? Well, this is where we get the dilemma principle, right? So when circumstances place two or more rules in conflict, the morally right act for those circumstances is the act that will produce the greatest overall utility. All right, so we've got two rules. We're kind of sliding back into act utilitarianism here, you see? So we've got two rules. We've got, we shouldn't lie, but we should also preserve and protect human life. These are both justified moral rules. They're in direct conflict. What do I do? I mean, it's really hard to figure out how much good, does this rule produce more good in society, or does this rule produce more good in society? Can I adjudicate between these? That is a really impossible thing to do, especially if you're standing there with a Nazi in your face. So in this case, the dilemma principle says you just kind of slide back into act utilitarianism. You just decide what is going to produce the greatest overall utility in this situation, right? So that's where most of us are going to slide back and say, whoa, better to lie, because regardless of how these rules work in society and how much good they may produce in society as a whole, in this particular circumstance, lying is going to produce the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people, right? Okay, so when you end up in a situation where you've got these two rules, you don't know what to do, you're just going to slide back into act utilitarianism. Okay, what do we think about that? Can you anticipate any problems with that? If you've read the chapter, you are already ahead. You're thinking, yes, I know how this is going to create some problems. We'll get there. Okay. At this point in the lecture outline, I have your discussion question for the week. I'm going to skip over that because I'm going to post it on the discussion board, but it is there in bright yellow, so you can't miss it. It's got instructions, so I'm going to let you just have to look at a scenario and then come up with two rules that conflict, and then, or two, not necessarily two rules that conflict, but two rules and decide which one is the better one to use in the circumstances. It's not an easy case, so I'm kind of interested to see how y'all are going to respond. For the most part, when I give you these sorts of discussion questions, sometimes there's a right answer, but oftentimes it's just, I want to see how well you think through the material, right? So just give me something that shows me that you can use these principles to reason to a conclusion. That's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in how well you're thinking through these things. So don't think, oh my gosh, there's a right answer. For this discussion question, there's not a right answer. I want to know how well reasoned your answer is. And that's what I care about. Okay? So, all right. This is actually going to be a really short lecture because this is actually a pretty short chapter. There's really not much to it. I have already gone through and discussed the differences between rule and act utilitarianism and the problems that with act utilitarianism that rule utilitarianism is supposed to solve. So that's actually next on the outline, but I've already gone over that, so you can review that yourself. All right, we're just jumping right into the problems with rule utilitarianism. I mean, this is going to be a relatively short lecture. Of course, I could find lots of shit to go on and on about for another 30 minutes. Everybody's like, no, please don't. Okay. Well, the first problem is that rules can conflict. All right, we just looked at a scenario where the rules can conflict. All right, well, that's where we just use the dilemma principle. And if you don't like that result, you're not alone. Some people are really not satisfied with that because basically it's like, okay, in any given situation, you could have a lot of rules that conflict. So then we're just going to slide back into act utilitarianism. And what is there could be any number of, you can think of lots and lots of different scenarios where the thing to do is to violate somebody's rights, or, so what good are the rules, right? The more complicated the scenario, the more likely we are to just fall back into act utilitarianism and then have all these problems pop up again. All right. The second problem that people tend to cite for rule utilitarianism is that it's inconsistent. So what's weird is, like, look, if we have conflicting rules in a given situation, and we have to decide what to do by sliding back into act utilitarianism, then act utilitarianism is okay sometimes. I mean, is it true or is it not true? Is act utilitarianism a true moral theory? Because if we're saying it's okay then to use act utilitarianism in these difficult circumstances where there's a dilemma, then we have to be able to say, well, it is a true theory. But if it's a true theory, then rule utilitarianism can't be a true theory, because rule utilitarianism gets different results in the same situations than act utilitarianism, right? So go back to, I know this is getting to be an old example, but I'm too old and too tired to think of a new one tonight. So torturing a child. Rule utilitarianism says that you ought not torture. You just ought not torture. The fact that that rule exists in society makes society better off than if it didn't exist, right? So we ought not torture. We ought not violate the basic human rights. That's another rule. You could say you ought not torture, or you might just say you ought not violate, or should not, ought not, means the same thing. We shouldn't violate basic human rights. That seems really clear to me, right? But an act utilitarian is going to say, no, actually in that scenario, the right thing to do is to torture the child. So you're going to get this, there are going to be cases where rule utilitarianism and act utilitarianism are going to get the wrong, or not wrong, but one of them has to be wrong, because either torturing the child is right or it's wrong. It's not both, but you're getting a right and a wrong. Each theory gives you a different result. Which theory is correct? Remember, we're assuming objectivism is true, right? And if objectivism is true, only one of them can be right, because there is a fact of the matter about whether or not torturing the child in this case is right or wrong. There's a fact about that. It is either right or wrong. So which of them is correct? So it might not, this problem might not seem like a big deal, but it kind of is. It's like, well, we're just kind of doing our best, and I don't know. What we want is we want a moral theory that doesn't produce inconsistencies. So rule utilitarianism allows for us to apply principles that are going to lead to inconsistencies in other scenarios, right? I don't know if that makes sense. Like trying to highlight how problematic this actually is. Let me go to the next point, because this might help illustrate exactly how problematic this inconsistency problem is, okay? The third issue with rule utilitarianism is that it basically collapses into act utilitarianism. So the dilemma principle is the beginning of that sort of collapse, right? Well, there are other conditions under which things are going to sort of collapse. So there are always exceptions to rules. So you might think that you ought not kill other human beings. Okay, so maybe that's a moral rule. You shouldn't kill other human beings. But, and it seems like it's easily justified. I mean, it seems like society's better off if people widely follow that rule than if they don't. But here's a scenario. You might think that it's okay to kill in self-defense. And we do typically think you are morally justified in killing someone in self-defense. Okay, so now we have a rule that says you shouldn't kill people except in instances of self-defense. Okay. What about if you're at war? You might think, now not everybody's going to think this, but you might think that you're justified in killing people in war. Maybe it's a just war. Maybe you're killing Nazis. You might be able to say, oh, well, that's a type of self-defense. Maybe, but it's war. That's a different arena, right? There are a whole different set of conditions when you're talking about war. So you might want to add an exception to your rule here. So you shouldn't kill other human beings except in cases of self-defense and war. Okay. Can you think of any other times when it might be justified to kill a human? Notice I didn't say a person. I said a human. You'll understand why I'm making this distinction. What about if you have a woman who's in her first trimester of pregnancy and she is going to suffer severe complications if she doesn't terminate the pregnancy, right? We're talking first trimester. I'm going to make this as simple as possible. First trimester of pregnancy, even though it's a fetus, it's still a human fetus, right? So it's not a person, but it is a human fetus, okay? So it still counts under this general rule that we ought not kill human beings. It's a human being. It's just not a person. So the argument, well, it's not a person. It's just not. It doesn't have any of the capacities that are required to be considered a person, especially at that early stage, right? So you might think that under these extreme circumstances where a woman is going to suffer a very painful death unless she has an abortion, you might think that, okay, it's justifiable. It's morally justifiable to save the mother's life under these kind of conditions, right? So then you have a rule that says one shouldn't kill other human beings except in cases of self-defense and war and abortion when the mother's life is in danger. You might even want to stipulate that, only in like the first or second trimester, right? You can get really specific with it. But what about this? What if you find out about a plot? Suppose there's this fascist dictator. Suppose there's a fascist dictator who is plotting to take over the U.S. government. Or to stay as president. Anyway, okay, so I know we're all taught not to talk about religion or politics, but this is a philosophy class, and religion and politics are fair game. But I'm not going to bring this up. So just suppose there's a fascist dictator who's attempting to overthrow the United States, and that they have malintent. They want to do this because they want to eradicate all non-white people. Okay? They're not a Nazi, but they're just really fucking racist. Okay? So suppose you've got this really fucking racist fascist dictator who is capable of and is plotting to take over the US government. And also suppose, this for a fact, it's indisputable, okay? So you have this knowledge. And you're also in a situation where you can assassinate this guy very easily. Just, boom, clean strike. Should you do it? I don't know. It seems to me like this might be an exception to the rule of you shouldn't kill human beings. Because just keep adding exceptions, right? All right. So how would we justify this? Well, if you're going to be an act utilitarian, you can say, well, it produces the greatest amount of good. Obviously, you should kill the dictator. But you can also come up with some moral rule for that. You can say, oh, according to rule utilitarianism, that might be the correct thing to do because we ought to protect and preserve human life. And I know this guy wants to commit genocide. So this action protects and promotes human life. Right? So now we have a rule that says we shouldn't kill human beings except in all of these situations, all of these conditions. All right? So the more fine-tuned your rule gets and the more exceptions you put in there, the more you really your rule is only going to apply to a very narrow range of situations, right? And rules that apply to only a very narrow range of situation just sort of look like act utilitarianism. It looks like you're making a decision about what to do in a very particular situation. You're going to have situation-specific rules. The more refined they get, they're going to end up being situation-specific rules, right? So we can do a very, very fine-tuned rule for abortion. Suppose that abortion is wrong, except when now we get into all of our little details, right? When we just start fine-tuning this rule, well, then it looks like that's going to apply to a very narrow range of situations. You just pretty much got situation-specific rules. How is that any different than act utilitarianism? It's not, right? So the dilemma principle sort of narrows the distance between rule utilitarianism and act utilitarianism, and then this problem with the fine-tuning of rules just collapses the whole thing entirely. So why do we even have rule utilitarianism? Especially since it gets different results than act utilitarianism. So if we're going to be defaulting to act utilitarianism all the time, and act utilitarianism is going to get a different set of results under certain conditions than rule utilitarianism, why are we doing that at all? Okay? We want the correct moral theory. A true moral theory is going to give us only the moral truths, right? It's going to tell us exactly what the moral facts are, right? What things are morally right and what things are morally wrong. A moral theory, a true moral theory, is going to give us all and only the moral truths. Well, if it conflicts with rule utilitarianism, but rule utilitarianism sort of collapses down into act utilitarianism, then you would think that act utilitarianism is in fact the true moral theory. So rule utilitarianism, since it gets a different result in different situations than act utilitarianism, then it must not be a correct moral theory. So what justification is there for using it? It's easier. I mean, it's got some benefits, but either act utilitarianism is true or rule utilitarianism is true. They can't both be true at the same time because they get different results. They tell you different things are morally correct, and that's inconsistent. And you can't have inconsistency in a moral theory. So if you've got rule utilitarianism that slides into act utilitarianism and then slides back into rule utilitarianism, that doesn't look like a good thing. In fact, it's not. It's the inconsistencies in a theory, in a philosophical theory, are death. That kills the theory. So, that's it. That's pretty much it. So 45 minutes about. Okay, so that's not bad. So that is it. Yay! I keep saying that. I'm like, I'm done. We're done. It's all done. I'm gonna drink to that. All right. Well, I will be seeing your posts on the discussion board this week. So, bye.